My hands trembled as I applied lipstick in the rearview mirror of my Honda Civic, the same coral shade I'd worn for 30 years. The parking lot of Romano's Italian Bistro stretched before me like a stage I wasn't ready to walk onto. At 67, I thought my days of nervous first dates were long behind me, buried with Robert in that quiet cemetery plot overlooking the lake. But here I was, smoothing down my navy dress, the one my daughter insisted made my eyes sparkle like they used to, preparing to meet a stranger my neighbor Betty had insisted would be perfect for me. "He's a widower too, Margaret," she'd said over our morning coffee 2 weeks ago. "Lost his wife 3 years back. Sweet man, loves books and classical music, just like you." What Betty hadn't mentioned was his name until yesterday, when she casually dropped it like a stone into still water. "Oh, by the way, his name is Thomas Mitchell." Thomas Mitchell. I hadn't spoken that name aloud in 43 years, hadn't allowed myself to think it in nearly 20. Yet hearing it again sent my heart into the same wild rhythm it had known when I was 24, and foolishly, desperately in love with a boy who'd promised me forever, then vanished with the morning light and a note that simply read, "I'm not ready for this life, Maggie. Forgive me." I told myself it couldn't be the same Thomas. Mitchell was a common enough name, and what were the odds? Still, as I walked across the parking lot, my sensible heels clicking against the asphalt, I couldn't shake the feeling that destiny was playing some elaborate joke on me. The hostess, a girl young enough to be my granddaughter, smiled warmly as I gave her the name for the reservation. "Right this way, Mrs. Fletcher. Your companion hasn't arrived yet, but I'll show you to your table." The restaurant hummed with the gentle murmur of evening conversations, the soft clink of silverware against china. I chose the seat facing the entrance, a habit Robert had always teased me about. "You never want to miss anything, do you, Maggie?" he'd say, and I'd laugh because it was true. I'd always been the type to watch, to observe, to prepare myself for whatever might walk through the door. But nothing could have prepared me for this. He walked in at 7:15, exactly 15 minutes late, just as he always had been. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him scan the restaurant, those same green eyes I'd memorized so many decades ago, now framed by silver hair and deeper lines. He'd aged, of course, we both had, but I would have known the set of his shoulders anywhere. The way he tilted his head slightly when he was thinking, the careful way he moved, as if he were perpetually afraid of taking up too much space. Thomas Mitchell. My Thomas Mitchell. He spotted me before I could compose myself, and I watched his face go through the same shock I felt coursing through my veins. His step faltered, just slightly, and for a moment I thought he might turn around and leave. Instead, he straightened his tie, a nervous gesture I remembered, and walked toward my table with the measured pace of a man approaching either salvation or execution. "Margaret," he said, and my name sounded strange on his lips after all these years. Not Maggie, the way he used to whisper it against my ear in the back seat of his father's Buick. Just Margaret, formal and distant as the space between who we'd been and who we'd become. "Hello, Thomas." I surprised myself with how steady my voice sounded. Inside, I felt 24 again, giddy and terrified and angry all at once. "Please, sit down." He pulled out the chair across from me, his movements careful and deliberate. Up close, I could see the toll the years had taken, the deep grooves around his eyes, the slight tremor in his left hand as he reached for his water glass. But he was still handsome in that quiet way that had always made my heart skip. Still Thomas, despite everything. "I should have told Betty," he said finally, his voice rougher than I remembered. "When she mentioned your name, I should have said something. But He trailed off, shaking his head. "I wasn't sure you'd come if you knew." Would you have? I asked, genuinely curious. Come, I mean, if you'd known it was me? He was quiet for a long moment, studying his hands. When he looked up, there was something raw in his expression that took me back to that last night we'd spent together, when he'd held me close and whispered promises neither of us believed he'd keep. Yes, he said simply, I would have come. The waitress appeared at our table, bright and cheerful, oblivious to the decades of history sitting between the bread basket and the wine list. We ordered, him the chicken parmesan, me the seafood risotto, making small talk about the weather, the restaurant, anything but the enormous elephant that had settled itself at our table and was refusing to budge. You look wonderful, Margaret, Thomas said after the waitress left. Different, but wonderful. I laughed, the sound sharper than I'd intended. Different is one word for it. Older, grayer, whiter. I'm a grandmother now, Thomas. Can you imagine? Me chasing after 3-year-olds and attending PTA meetings. I can, actually. His smile was soft, sad. You always talked about wanting children, a whole house full of them. The memory hit me like a physical blow. Lazy Sunday mornings in his tiny apartment, planning our future with the confidence of youth. The house we'd buy, the children we'd raise, the life we'd build together. All of it reduced to ash by a single note left on my kitchen table. I had two, I said quietly. Sarah and Michael, both grown now, with families of their own. I know. The words were so soft I almost missed them. I mean, Betty mentioned it. She's very proud of her friend Margaret, talks about your children all the time. There was something in his tone that made me look at him more closely. What about you? Children? He shook his head, the gesture heavy with what looked like regret. No. Carol and I, we tried for years. It just wasn't meant to be, I guess. Carol, his wife, the woman who'd had 40 years with him while I'd made a life with Robert, who'd been kind and steady and everything Thomas hadn't been. The comparison felt both unfair and inevitable. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it, about your wife. Betty told me she passed away 3 years ago. Cancer. The word dropped between us like a stone. She fought it for 2 years, but... He shrugged, the gesture of a man who'd learned that sometimes there are no words for the deepest losses. She was a good woman, patient with my moods, forgiving of my faults. She deserved better than what life gave her. I wanted to ask if he'd loved her, but the question seemed both too intimate and pointless. Of course he'd loved her. People didn't stay married for 40 years without love, did they? The real question was whether he'd loved her the way he'd once claimed to love me, with that desperate, consuming passion that made everything else fade to background noise. Our food arrived, giving us something to focus on besides the minefield of our shared past. I picked at my risotto, my appetite diminished by the strange unreality of the situation. Here I was, having dinner with the man who'd broken my heart so thoroughly I'd spent months unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to imagine a future without him in it. And now he was just another elderly man, cutting his chicken into careful pieces, taking his time to chew because his teeth weren't what they used to be. Why did you do it? The question escaped before I could stop it, hanging in the air between us like an accusation. Why did you leave? Thomas set down his fork, his face going pale. I could see him weighing his words, deciding how much truth this moment could bear. I was scared, he said finally. 25 years old and scared out of my mind. You were so sure about everything, about us, about the future. You had it all planned out, and I couldn't breathe for thinking about how I was going to let you down. So you decided to let me down sooner rather than later? The bitterness in my voice surprised me. I'd thought I'd made peace with this long ago, but apparently some wounds never fully heal, just scab over until something picks at them again. I thought it would be kinder, he said quietly. A clean break instead of years of watching me disappoint you. I was young and stupid and convinced that I was saving you from a lifetime of misery. That wasn't your choice to make. The words came out harder than I'd intended, and I saw him flinch. You didn't get to decide what I could or couldn't handle. You just left, Thomas, without a conversation, without giving me a chance to fight for us. You made the decision for both of us and then disappeared. He nodded, accepting the rebuke. You're right. I was a coward. I've spent 43 years knowing that, regretting it every single day. Don't. I held up my hand, suddenly exhausted by the weight of old anger. Don't make me into some tragic figure you've been mourning all these years. I had a good life, Thomas. I married Robert 6 years after you left, had my children, built a career I was proud of. I was happy. Were you? He asked, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. Really happy? The question caught me off guard. Had I been happy? I'd told myself I was. For 40 years, I'd believed it. Robert had been a good husband, steady and reliable in all the ways Thomas hadn't been. He'd never made my heart race the way Thomas had, but he'd never broken it either. Our love had been quieter, safer, built on shared values and mutual respect, rather than the wild passion I'd known with Thomas. Yes, I said, but the word felt hollow, even to me, different than what I'd imagined, but yes, happy. Thomas watched me carefully, as if he could read the uncertainty beneath my words. I'm glad, he said, and I thought he might actually mean it. You deserved happiness, Maggie, more than anyone I've ever known. Maggie. The name sounded strange after an hour of being Margaret, like slipping into clothes I'd outgrown but couldn't quite bring myself to throw away. Don't call me that, I said softly. That person is gone. She died the morning I found your note. His face crumpled slightly, and for a moment I saw the boy I'd loved instead of the man he'd become. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Margaret. If I could go back, if I could change it. But you can't. I set down my fork, appetite officially gone. And neither can I. We're not those people anymore, Thomas. We're strangers who happen to share a history, nothing more. The silence stretched between us, heavy with all the words we'd never said, all the years we'd lived apart. The restaurant continued its gentle hum around us, other couples sharing intimate conversations, celebrating anniversaries, beginning their own love stories. I envied them their simplicity, their freedom from the weight of what if and if only. Would you like to leave? Thomas asked finally. We could take a walk, maybe, talk somewhere more private. I considered it, weighing the wisdom of prolonging this encounter against the curiosity that had been building all evening. There were questions I'd carried for 4 decades, wounds that had never properly healed because I'd never understood why they'd been inflicted in the first place. All right, I said, surprising myself. A walk sounds nice. He paid the check despite my protests, and we made our way out into the cool October evening. The parking lot was nearly full now, the dinner crowd in full swing. Without discussing it, we began walking toward the small park across the street, our footsteps falling into the rhythm I remembered from so many evening strolls in our youth. Tell me about them, Thomas said as we settled onto a bench beneath a street lamp. Your children. I found myself smiling despite everything. Sarah's the practical one. She's a pediatric nurse married to a wonderful man named David. They have twin boys who are 8 now, and they keep me on my toes when I babysit. Michael is my dreamer. He's a high school English teacher, single by choice. He says he's too busy inspiring young minds to worry about romance, but I think he just hasn't met the right person yet. They sound wonderful. They are. They're worried about me, actually. Think I've been alone too long since Robert died. That's probably why Betty felt so confident setting this up. My children have been not so subtly hinting that I should get back out there, meet someone new. And how do you feel about that? Meeting someone new? I looked at him, this man who was both stranger and intimate friend, and tried to find an honest answer. Terrified, I admitted. Robert and I were together for 36 years. He was my best friend, my partner, the father of my children. The idea of starting over at my age, of learning someone else's habits and quirks and moods, it feels impossible. But you came tonight. I did. I laughed softly. Though if I'd known it was you, I'm not sure I would have. Why not? The question was quiet, curious rather than hurt. I considered it, watching a young couple walk by hand in hand, lost in each other and the future they thought they were building. Because you represent all the roads I didn't take, I said finally. All the what-ifs I spent years trying not to think about. Seeing you again, it makes me wonder if I chose the safe path instead of the right one. And what if you did? He asked gently. Would that be so terrible? Safety has value, Margaret. Stability, predictability, the knowledge that someone will be there every morning when you wake up. I envied you that, all those years with Robert. You don't know anything about my years with Robert. No, he agreed, but I know you, knew you. You were the kind of person who deserved certainty, who deserved someone who would choose you every single day without question. I wasn't that person then. And now? The question slipped out before I could stop it, and I felt my cheeks heat with embarrassment. I'm sorry, I didn't mean. Now I'm 70 years old, set in my ways. Probably too old to change, he said with a self-deprecating smile. But yes, now I think I could be. Time has a way of teaching you what matters, of burning away all the fears and doubts that seem so important when you're young. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the evening unfold around us. A group of teenagers walked by, loud and careless in their invincibility, and I found myself thinking about the versions of ourselves who had walked these same streets so many years ago, so certain we had all the time in the world. I kept track of you, Thomas said suddenly. Over the years, I mean. Not in a stalking way, he added quickly, seeing my expression. But in a small town, word gets around. I knew when you got married, when you had your children. I even saw you once at the grocery store about 15 years ago. You were with your son, Michael, I think. He looked just like you did at that age. Why didn't you say anything? What would have been the point? You looked happy. You had a life, a family. I was just some mistake from your past. You were never a mistake, I said, the words coming from some deep, unguarded place. Loving you was never a mistake, Thomas. It was losing you that nearly broke me. His hand found mine on the bench, and I was startled by how familiar the touch felt, how easily my fingers intertwined with his despite the decades that had passed. His skin was rougher now, marked with age spots and the thin fragility of advanced years, but his touch still sent warmth up my arm and straight to my heart. I never stopped loving you, he said quietly. I want you to know that. Carol was a good woman, and I cared for her deeply, but what we had, it was different, comfortable, companionate. What you and I had was like lightning in a bottle. Lightning burns out, I said, but I didn't pull my hand away. Sometimes, but sometimes it lights a fire that burns for a lifetime. I looked at him then, really looked, and saw past the wrinkles and gray hair to the man I'd loved with the passionate intensity that only comes once in a lifetime. The man who taught me what desire felt like, what it meant to want someone so completely that their absence left a physical ache. I'm not 24 anymore, Thomas, I said. I'm 67 years old, with arthritis in my knees and reading glasses on every table in my house. I take medication for my blood pressure, and I go to bed at 10 o'clock. I'm not the girl you remember. And I'm not the boy who was too scared to fight for what he wanted, he replied. I'm 70 years old with a bad back and a heart condition my doctor watches carefully. I fall asleep in my chair watching television, and I can't remember where I put my keys half the time. But when I look at you, Margaret, I see both versions, the girl you were and the woman you became. And I find myself hoping, despite everything, that maybe it's not too late for us. The words hung in the air between us, full of possibility and danger in equal measure. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Two senior citizens sitting on a park bench talking about second chances and rekindled romance like teenagers with their whole lives ahead of them. But another part of me, the part that had never quite stopped being 24 and in love, felt something stir that I thought had died with Robert. I don't know how to do this, I admitted. How to start over, how to trust someone with my heart again, especially you. We don't have to figure it all out tonight, he said gently. We could just see, have coffee sometime, maybe dinner again, somewhere without quite so much history attached to it. I studied his face in the lamplight, looking for signs of the boy who'd left me with nothing but a note and a broken heart. But all I could see was a man who'd lived a full life, who'd loved and lost and learned from his mistakes. A man who was offering me something I'd thought was behind me forever, the possibility of love. I'm scared, I whispered. So am I, he admitted, terrified, actually. But I spent 43 years being afraid, Margaret. I don't want to spend whatever time I have left regretting that I was too scared to try. A car pulled into the parking lot across the street, its headlights sweeping across the park. The beam caught us for a moment, two elderly figures holding hands on a bench, and I wondered what story a stranger might imagine for us. Long married couple out for an evening stroll, old friends catching up after years apart. They'd never guess the truth, that we were the survivors of a love story that had begun and ended before most of the people in that restaurant had even been born. One coffee, I said finally, just coffee, and we take it slow. His smile was radiant, transforming his face into something that reminded me powerfully of the young man I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. Just coffee, he agreed, though I should probably warn you, I make terrible coffee. Carol used to say it could strip paint. I laughed, the sound surprising me with its genuine warmth. Well, then I'll make the coffee. I've had 43 years to perfect it. We walked back to the parking lot together, our steps slower than they'd once been, but somehow more purposeful. At my car, he hesitated, and I could see him fighting some internal battle between what he wanted to do and what he thought he should do. "May I?" he asked, gesturing vaguely. I knew what he was asking, and after a moment's hesitation, I nodded. He leaned down and kissed my cheek, soft and gentle and achingly familiar. His cologne was different now, something warmer, more subtle than the aftershave he'd worn in his 20s, but the feeling of his lips on my skin sent me tumbling through time. "Thank you," he said as he pulled back, "for tonight, for listening, for giving us a chance." "Thank you for coming," I replied, "for being brave enough to stay when you could have run." "I'm done running," he said simply, "from you, from us, from whatever this might become." I drove home through the quiet streets of our small town, past houses where families were settling in for the evening, past the coffee shop where we'd arranged to meet the following Thursday, past the cemetery where Robert lay buried beneath a simple granite stone. I should have felt guilty, I thought. I should have been wrestling with the idea that I was somehow betraying his memory by opening my heart to the possibility of love again. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in the 3 years since Robert's death: hope. Not the quiet, resigned hope of making the best of what remained, but the bright, terrifying hope of new beginnings. The hope of discovering that it was possible to have more than one great love in a lifetime. My house felt different when I walked through the door, charged with possibility in a way that had nothing to do with the familiar surroundings. I made myself a cup of tea and settled into Robert's old reading chair, looking at the framed photographs that lined the mantel. Robert and me on our wedding day, glowing with quiet happiness. The children at various ages, gap-toothed and grinning. Family vacations, holidays, all the ordinary moments that make up a life. I'd been happy with Robert, I realized. Different than the wild, passionate love I'd shared with Thomas, but happy nonetheless. He'd been my anchor, my safe harbor in all the storms that life had brought our way. Loving him hadn't been settling for less. It had been choosing something different, something that fit the woman I'd become after Thomas left. But now Thomas was back, offering me the chance to discover who I might become if I let myself love him again. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely insane for a woman my age. It was also, I was beginning to suspect, exactly what I needed. I picked up the phone to call Sarah, to tell her about the evening's unexpected developments, then set it down again. This was too new, too fragile to share just yet. Instead, I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, catching sight of myself in the mirror as I prepared for bed. The woman looking back at me was older, certainly, marked by time and loss and the accumulated weight of living. But there was something new in her eyes, something that hadn't been there that morning. She looked, I thought, with a mixture of amazement and terror, like a woman who was falling in love again. As I settled into bed, I found myself thinking about Thomas's words. Sometimes lightning lights a fire that burns for a lifetime. Maybe he was right. Maybe what we'd had all those years ago hadn't burned out after all, just gone underground, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Or maybe I was a foolish old woman, setting herself up for another heartbreak. Either way, I thought as I drifted off to sleep, it was going to be an interesting journey. The coffee shop was busier than I'd expected for a Thursday morning, filled with the usual mix of students hunched over laptops, business people grabbing their morning caffeine fix, and retirees like myself who had nowhere more pressing to be. I'd arrived 15 minutes early, partly from nervousness and partly from habit. Robert used to tease me that I'd arrive early for my own funeral. I'd chosen a table near the window where I could watch for Thomas while keeping an eye on the street outside. My hands wrapped around my latte, I found myself studying every silver-haired man who walked by, my heart jumping each time I thought I spotted him. It was ridiculous, really. I was acting like a teenager waiting for her prom date, not a widow of 3 years meeting an old friend for coffee. Old friend. Was that what Thomas was now? The term felt both too casual and too loaded, carrying none of the weight of our shared history, while somehow managing to ignore everything that had passed between us just 4 days ago. He appeared at exactly 10 o'clock, visible through the window as he approached the coffee shop with that careful, measured walk I remembered. He'd dressed nicely, khakis and a navy sweater that brought out his eyes, a light jacket slung over one arm. I watched him pause outside the door, straightening his shoulders in a gesture so familiar it took my breath away. Even at 70, he still did that little ritual of preparing himself before entering a room. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped inside, scanning the room until his gaze found mine. His smile was warm but uncertain, and I found myself standing without conscious thought, smoothing down my own carefully chosen outfit, a cream-colored blouse and brown slacks that Sarah had helped me pick out last year, claiming they made me look distinguished but approachable. "Margaret," he said as he reached my table, and I could hear the relief in his voice. "I wasn't entirely sure you'd come." "Neither was I," admitted, gesturing for him to sit, "but here we are." "Here we are," he echoed, settling into the chair across from me. "Can I get you anything? Another latte?" I shook my head, lifting my still full cup. "I'm good, thank you." Though you should probably get something before the morning rush really hits. He nodded and made his way to the counter, moving with the careful economy of motion that comes with age. I watched him order black coffee, no sugar, and remembered how he'd taken his coffee in college. 3 sugars and enough cream to turn it the color of caramel. Amazing how people changed over the decades, abandoning the sweetness of youth for the bitter clarity of experience. "So," he said as he rejoined me, wrapping his hands around his steaming mug, "how have you been? Since Sunday, I mean." It was such an ordinary question, the kind strangers ask each other while waiting in line at the grocery store. But coming from him, it carried the weight of everything unspoken between us. "Confused," I said honestly, and maybe a little angry, if I'm being completely truthful. His face fell slightly. Angry at me? For not telling you who I was? Angry at the situation, I think. At Betty for her well-meaning meddling, at myself for agreeing to that dinner in the first place, at you, yes, but also I gestured vaguely, searching for words, at time, maybe, at the way life takes these sharp left turns just when you think you've got everything figured out. He nodded, understanding. I felt the same way since Sunday. Like I've been sleepwalking for the past 3 years, and suddenly I'm awake again. It's disorienting. Sleepwalking, I repeated. That's exactly it. I thought I was doing well, adjusting to life alone, finding my footing again. But seeing you, it's like someone turned the lights on in a room I didn't realize had gone dark. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping our coffee and watching the morning crowd flow around us. A young mother wrestled with a stroller while balancing her own drink and a toddler sippy cup. A businessman in an expensive suit tapped impatiently at his phone while waiting for his order. College students debated the merits of some professor whose name I didn't recognize. "Do you ever feel invisible?" Thomas asked suddenly. "Like you're watching life happen around you, but you're not quite part of it anymore?" The question caught me off guard with its accuracy. "All the time," I admitted, "especially since Robert died. It's like I became a ghost in my own life, going through the motions, having the same conversations with the same people, existing, but not really living." "That's exactly how I felt with Carol toward the end," he said quietly. "Not because of anything she did wrong, but because we'd fallen into this comfortable pattern that didn't require any real engagement from either of us. We were like 2 people sharing a house, but living separate lives." "Is that why you never had children?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, and I immediately felt heat rise in my cheeks. "I'm sorry, that's too personal." "No, it's all right." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it might hold the answers to questions he'd been avoiding for decades. "We tried, early on. For about 5 years, we went through all the tests, all the treatments. Nothing worked, and eventually we just stopped talking about it, stopped trying. I think we both assumed it was my fault, though we never said so out loud." "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. "That must have been devastating." It was, for a while, but Carol threw herself into her teaching. She was a high school librarian, and I focused on work. We built a good life together, just the 2 of us, different than what we'd planned, but good. There was something in his tone that made me look at him more closely. But he met my eyes, and I saw a pain there that went deeper than simple regret. But I always wondered if the problem wasn't medical at all, if maybe I just couldn't let myself fully commit to that life, to her, because part of me was still what? Still in love with someone else, he finished quietly. The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making my heart race in a way that had nothing to do with my morning caffeine. I stared at him, this man who'd broken my heart so thoroughly I'd spent years putting myself back together, and felt something crack open inside my chest. "Thomas," I whispered, but he held up a hand, stopping me. "I know how that sounds," he said. "I know it's not fair to Carol's memory, or to you, or to anyone, really. But you asked for honesty, and that's the truth I've been carrying for 43 years. I loved my wife, Margaret. I was faithful to her. I took care of her when she was sick. I mourned her when she died. but the deepest part of my heart never stopped belonging to you. I felt tears prick at my eyes, a mixture of pain and anger, and something that might have been gratitude. You don't get to say that to me, I said, my voice shaking. You don't get to tell me you spent 40 years loving me from afar while I was building a life with someone else, raising children, growing old with a man who chose me every single day. You're right, he said. I'm sorry. That was selfish of me. It was. I wiped at my eyes with a napkin, grateful that the coffee shop was noisy enough to mask our conversation from the other patrons. But it was also honest, and I suppose I should appreciate that after all these years of wondering. Wondering what? Whether you ever thought about me. Whether leaving was as easy as you made it look. I took a shaky breath, steadying myself. I used to drive past your old apartment sometimes, in those first few months after you left. It was empty, of course, but I'd park across the street and just sit there, trying to understand how someone could disappear so completely from another person's life. It wasn't easy, he said quietly. Leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done. But I was 25 and convinced I was doing the right thing, the noble thing. I thought you'd be better off without me. That wasn't your decision to make, I said, echoing my words from Sunday night. You robbed us both of the chance to fight for what we had, to find out if it was real enough to last. I know that now. I've known it for decades. But knowing it and knowing what to do about it are two different things entirely. A group of teenagers burst through the door, loud and energetic in the way that only adolescents can. They reminded me of my grandchildren, all boundless energy and certainty that the world would bend to their will. I envied them their confidence, their assumption that they had all the time in the world to make mistakes and correct them. "What do you want from me, Thomas?" I asked when the noise level dropped back to manageable. "Why are we here having this conversation? Because if you're looking for absolution, I'm not sure I'm the person to give it to you." He was quiet for so long I wondered if he'd heard me. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I want a second chance," he said. "I know I don't deserve one. I know it's probably too late, but I want the opportunity to love you the way I should have 43 years ago, completely, without reservation, without fear." "We're not the same people we were then," I said, but the words lacked conviction. "No, we're not. We're better. We know what it means to lose someone, to waste time, to let fear make decisions that should be made with love. We know how precious this is, Margaret, how rare it is to find someone who sees you, really sees you, and loves what they find. And if we try and it doesn't work, if we discover that what we had was just youthful infatuation, something that couldn't survive the reality of two old people with set ways and limited time, then we'll know," he said simply. "We'll have tried, and we'll have our answer. But if we don't try, if we let fear win again, we'll spend whatever time we have left wondering what if." I looked at him across the small table, this man who represented every road not taken, every choice I'd second-guessed in the quiet moments between sleep and waking. He was older now, marked by time and loss and the accumulated weight of living. But his eyes were the same eyes that had looked at me with such longing all those years ago, and his hands were the same hands that had traced my face in the darkness of his tiny apartment. "I don't know how to do this," I said again. "I don't know how to be vulnerable at 70, how to risk my heart when I'm not sure it's strong enough to survive another breaking." "We'll go slow," he said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "As slow as you need. We have time, Margaret. Maybe not the decades we had when we were young, but we have time." I looked down at our joined hands, his weathered and spotted with age, mine soft from years of hand cream and gentle living. Together they told the story of two lives fully lived, marked by joy and sorrow and all the ordinary moments that make up a human existence. Coffee, I said finally. Just coffee, once a week, and we see how it goes. His smile was radiant. Just coffee, he agreed. Though I have to warn you, I'm going to want to tell you everything. Every day of the last 43 years, every thought I've had about you, every regret and hope I've carried. That's a lot of coffee dates, I said, surprised by the lightness in my own voice. I'm hoping so, he said softly. I'm hoping for more coffee dates than either of us knows what to do with. As we prepared to leave, gathering our coats and finishing the last sips of our drinks, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't the wild, desperate love of youth, but something deeper and more sustainable. It was the possibility of companionship, of shared memories and gentle laughter, of growing old with someone who had known me when I was young. Same time next week? Thomas asked as we stepped out into the crisp autumn air. Same time, I agreed, and meant it. I watched him walk to his car, noting the careful way he moved, the slight stiffness in his gait that spoke of arthritis or old injuries. We were both fragile now, I realized, in ways we hadn't been when we were young and thought ourselves invincible. But maybe that fragility was what would make this work. The knowledge that time was precious, that second chances were rare and should be treated with the reverence they deserved. That afternoon, I called my daughter. "Mom?" Sarah's voice was bright with surprise when she answered. "This is unexpected. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," I said, settling into my reading chair with a cup of tea. "I just wanted to talk to you about something. About someone, actually." "Oh." Her tone shifted, becoming carefully neutral in the way that meant she was trying not to get her hopes up. "Mrs. Patterson's setup went well?" "It was complicated," I said, choosing my words carefully. "The man Betty introduced me to wasn't quite who I expected." "Bad complicated or good complicated?" I laughed despite myself. "I'm not entirely sure yet. Maybe both." "Mom, you're being mysterious. Just tell me what happened." So I did. I told her about Thomas, about our history, about the strange twist of fate that had brought us back together after all these years. I told her about his proposal for a second chance, about my terror and hope and complete uncertainty about what came next. Sarah was quiet for a long time when I finished. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "Mom, you know I want you to be happy. You know I've been worried about you since Dad died, worried that you were isolating yourself too much. But this man, he hurt you once, badly. What makes you think he won't do it again?" It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself since Sunday night. "I don't know that he won't," I admitted, "but I also don't know that he will. And I'm starting to think that maybe, at my age, the bigger risk is in not trying." "You're not that old, Mom. 67 is hardly ancient." "Old enough to know that tomorrow isn't guaranteed," I said. "Old enough to understand that some opportunities don't come around twice. And if he breaks your heart again?" I considered the question, surprised by how calm I felt when I answered. "Then I'll survive it, just like I did before. I'm stronger now, Sarah. I know who I am, what I can handle. The worst thing that could happen isn't him leaving. It's me spending whatever years I have left wondering what might have been." We talked for another hour, Sarah, asking careful questions about Thomas, about my feelings, about my plans going forward. By the time we hung up, I could hear the cautious approval in her voice, the recognition that this was something I needed to explore for myself. That evening, I found myself standing in front of the mirror in my bedroom, studying the woman looking back at me. She was older, certainly, her dark hair now silver, her face lined with decades of laughter and worry and grief. But there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there in years, a spark of anticipation, of possibility. I thought about Robert, about the life we'd built together, the love we'd shared. It had been good, I realized, in ways I was only now beginning to fully appreciate. Safe and steady, and filled with the kind of deep affection that grows stronger over time. He'd been my anchor, my constant, the steady presence that had allowed me to weather every storm. But Thomas had been lightning, dangerous and unpredictable and absolutely electric. The question now was whether lightning could strike twice in the same place, whether two old people could recapture something that had burned so brightly in their youth. Maybe we couldn't. Maybe we'd discover that we were strangers now, that the people we'd become had nothing in common beyond shared memories and faded photographs. But maybe, just maybe, we'd find something even better than what we'd lost, love tempered by experience, passion deepened by understanding, partnership built on the knowledge of how precious and fragile it all really was. A week later, I found myself back at the coffee shop, arriving early again but feeling less nervous this time. Thomas was already there, I discovered with surprise, sitting at the same table by the window with two steaming mugs in front of him. "I thought I'd order for both of us this time," he said as I approached. "Latte with 1 sugar, splash of vanilla." I remembered. "You remembered," I said, touched by the gesture. "Thank you." "I remember a lot of things," he said as I settled into my chair, "more than I probably should." We fell into conversation more easily this time, sharing stories about our children, his stepchildren from Carol's first marriage, who had welcomed him into their lives with surprising warmth, and our grandchildren, our careers, our hopes for the years ahead. It was comfortable in a way our first meeting hadn't been, like slipping into clothes that fit just right. "I have something to show you," Thomas said as we prepared to leave, pulling a small, worn photograph from his wallet. "I've carried this for 43 years. I looked down at the image, a young woman with dark hair and bright eyes, laughing at something outside the frame. It took me a moment to recognize myself, to remember the day it was taken. We'd been at the beach, I realized, one of our last weekends together before everything fell apart. "Thomas," I whispered, emotion clogging my throat. "I know it's probably strange, maybe even inappropriate, but when I look at this picture, I don't just see who you were, I see who you still are. The woman who laughs without reservation, who sees the best in people, who isn't afraid to love completely. That woman is still there, Margaret. I can see her." I stared at the photograph, remembering the girl I'd been, the dreams I'd carried, the absolute certainty that love could conquer anything. She seemed so young, so naive, so utterly unprepared for the heartbreak that was coming. But she'd also been brave, in a way I'd forgotten how to be, willing to risk everything for the possibility of happiness. "May I keep this?" I asked, surprising myself. "Of course, it belongs to you anyway." As I walked to my car that afternoon, the photograph tucked safely in my purse, I found myself thinking about the nature of time, about the way the past and present could collide in unexpected ways. I was no longer the girl in that picture, would never be her again. But maybe that was all right. Maybe the woman I'd become, scarred but stronger, cautious but still capable of hope, was exactly who I needed to be for whatever came next. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern. Coffee every Thursday, gradually extending to include walks through the park, visits to the local bookstore, even an afternoon at the art museum where we'd once spent countless hours as students. We were building something new on the foundation of what we'd once had, and to my surprise, it felt both familiar and completely foreign. Thomas was different than he'd been at 25, more thoughtful, more patient, more willing to listen than to talk. The boy who'd been so afraid of commitment had become a man who seemed to savor every moment we spent together, as if he were storing them up against some future famine. "Tell me about Robert," he said one Thursday as we sat on a bench feeding ducks at the pond. I know it might seem strange, but I want to understand who you became when I wasn't looking. It was a generous request, one that spoke to the emotional maturity neither of us had possessed in our youth. So I told him about my husband, about his kindness and reliability, his terrible jokes, and his way of humming while he worked in the garden. I told him about the life we'd built together, the quiet contentment we'd found in each other's company. He sounds like a good man, Thomas said when I finished. He was. He was exactly what I needed at that time in my life, steady and sure and completely present. He never made me wonder where I stood with him, never left me guessing about his feelings. Unlike me. Unlike you, I agreed. But that doesn't diminish what we had, Thomas. It was different, but it was real. He nodded, understanding. I'm glad you found that. Glad you had someone who loved you the way you deserved to be loved. It was one of many conversations that surprised me with their depth and honesty. We talked about Carol, about his years of teaching high school history, about the students who had touched his life and the ones who had broken his heart. We talked about our regrets and our hopes, our fears about aging, and our gratitude for the time we'd been given. Slowly, carefully, we began to rebuild trust. Not the blind faith of youth, but something more sustainable. Trust earned through consistency, through showing up when promised, through the thousand small kindnesses that make up a relationship between two people who understand how easily it can all disappear. It was during our 8th weekly coffee that Thomas asked the question I'd been both expecting and dreading. Margaret, he said, his hands wrapped around his mug as if it could anchor him. I know we said we'd take this slow, and I don't want to rush you into anything you're not ready for, but I was wondering. Would you consider having dinner with me? A real dinner, not just coffee and conversation. I looked at him across the small table, this man who had been the great love of my youth and was slowly becoming something I couldn't quite name in my later years. The request was simple enough, but we both knew it represented a step forward, a deepening of whatever this was between us. What kind of dinner? I asked, stalling for time. My house, he said. I'll cook. Nothing fancy, just pasta and salad. But somewhere private, where we can talk without worrying about who might overhear. The offer hung between us, loaded with possibility and danger in equal measure. Going to his house would be crossing a line we hadn't crossed yet, moving from public meetings to private intimacy. It would be acknowledging that this was more than just two old friends catching up, that we were building towards something that looked suspiciously like a relationship. All right, I said before I could talk myself out of it. Saturday night? His smile was like sunrise, transforming his entire face. Saturday night. I spent the intervening days in a state of nervous anticipation that reminded me powerfully of my teenage years. I changed clothes 3 times on Saturday afternoon, finally settling on a simple blue dress that Sarah had bought me for my birthday. I did my hair and makeup with more care than I'd taken in years, studying myself in the mirror with critical eyes. Thomas lived in a small ranch house on the outskirts of town, the kind of modest home that suggested comfortable retirement rather than wealth. The yard was neatly maintained, but not obsessively so, with flower beds that showed signs of loving attention and a front porch that invited conversation. He answered the door before I could even ring the bell, as if he'd been watching for my car in the driveway. He'd dressed nicely too, I noticed, pressed slacks and a button-down shirt that brought out the blue in his eyes. Right on time, he said, stepping aside to let me in. I hope you're hungry. The house was warm and inviting, filled with the scent of garlic and herbs. It was clearly a bachelor's home, practical furniture, minimal decoration, everything clean but not particularly stylish. But there were touches that spoke to the man who lived there. Bookshelves lining one wall, classical music playing softly in the background, a chess set on the coffee table with a game in progress. Playing with yourself? I asked, nodding toward the chessboard. He laughed, the sound rich and genuine. Guilty. It's a problem I've been working on for weeks. Would you like some wine? I have a nice Chianti. That sounds lovely. As he moved around the kitchen, putting finishing touches on our meal, I found myself studying the space, looking for clues about the life he'd built here. There were photographs on the refrigerator, him with what must be Carol's children and grandchildren, vacation pictures, images from what looked like a retirement party. But there were no pictures of Carol herself, I noticed, nothing to suggest this had been their shared home. We moved here after she got sick, Thomas said, noticing my observation. Smaller house, easier to manage. After she died, I thought about moving again, but, he shrugged, seemed like too much effort for an old man living alone. Do you like it, living alone? He considered the question as he served our pasta, spooning sauce over al dente noodles with the care of someone who took cooking seriously. I thought I did, he said finally. These past 3 years, I convinced myself I was content with my books and my garden and my chess problems. But spending time with you, it's made me realize how lonely I've been, how much I've missed having someone to share things with. We ate by candlelight, the conversation flowing as easily as the wine. He told me about his years teaching, about the students who had challenged and inspired him, about the satisfaction he'd found in shaping young minds. I shared stories about my own career in library science, about the joy I'd found in connecting people with books, with information, with the stories that helped them make sense of their own lives. You always loved books, Thomas said as we lingered over our second glass of wine. I remember finding you in the library at all hours, completely lost in whatever you were reading. Still do, I admitted. Sarah worries that I read too much, that I use books to avoid dealing with real life. And do you? I considered the question, surprised by his directness. Sometimes, it's safer, living other people's stories instead of writing your own. But you're here, he pointed out gently, tonight, with me. That's not hiding. No, I agreed, it's not. After dinner, we moved to the living room, settling onto his comfortable sofa with our wine glasses. The evening had grown dark outside, and the lamplight cast everything in warm, intimate shadows. I felt relaxed in a way I hadn't expected, comfortable in his space, in his presence, in a way that spoke to something deeper than mere familiarity. Margaret, Thomas said, setting down his wineglass and turning to face me fully. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have said weeks ago. My heart skipped, fear flooding through me. Here it was, I thought, the moment when he revealed some hidden truth that would shatter the fragile trust we'd been building. Another woman, perhaps, or health problems he'd been hiding, or simply the admission that this had all been some elaborate exercise in nostalgia. What is it? I asked, proud of how steady my voice sounded. I'm falling in love with you, he said simply. Again, or maybe still, I'm not sure which. But sitting here with you tonight, listening to you laugh, watching the way you gesture when you get excited about something, I'm falling in love with both versions of you, the girl you were and the woman you've become. The words hit me like a physical force, stealing my breath and making my heart race. I stared at him, this man who had just handed me his heart with the same careless courage he'd shown when we were young, and felt something crack open inside my chest. "Thomas," I whispered, but he held up a hand, stopping me. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I know it's too soon. I know we said we'd take it slow, but I couldn't spend another evening with you without being honest about what I'm feeling. I love you, Margaret. I love your laugh and your intelligence and the way you see the world. I love the woman who raised 2 children and built a career and survived the loss of her husband with grace and dignity. I love who you were and who you are and whoever you're becoming." Tears were streaming down my face, though I hadn't realized I was crying. "You can't," I said, the words coming from some deep, panicked place. "You can't love me, Thomas. We're too old for this kind of intensity, too fragile for this kind of risk." Says who? He asked gently, reaching out to wipe the tears from my cheek. Who decided that love has an expiration date, that passion is only for the young? Everyone, I said, laughing despite my tears. Society, our children, common sense. Well, they're all wrong, he said firmly. Love doesn't diminish with age, Margaret. If anything, it becomes more precious, more powerful, because we understand how rare it is. I looked at him through my tears, this man who had broken my heart and was now offering to heal it, and felt something shift inside me. The fear was still there, would probably always be there, but it was being overwhelmed by something stronger. Not the desperate passion of youth, but something deeper and more sustainable. The recognition that we had been given an extraordinary gift, a second chance that most people never get. "I'm scared," I whispered. "So am I," he admitted. "Terrified, actually. But I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you." The words hung between us, a challenge and a promise and a plea all at once. I thought about Robert, about the safe love we'd shared, the comfortable partnership that had sustained us for 36 years. He would want me to be happy, I realized. He'd always put my happiness above his own comfort, and he wouldn't want me to spend my remaining years alone simply out of loyalty to his memory. "I love you too," I said, the words coming out in a rush. I've been trying not to, trying to convince myself this was just nostalgia or loneliness or some kind of senior citizen midlife crisis. But sitting here with you, talking and laughing and remembering what it feels like to be seen by someone, I love you, Thomas. I love who you were and who you've become, and the man who's brave enough to offer his heart to someone who's already broken it once. His kiss was gentle and tentative, nothing like the passionate embraces of our youth, but somehow more meaningful for its restraint. His lips were softer than I remembered, his hands steadier, his touch imbued with the reverence of someone who understood how precious this moment was. "What happens now?" I asked when we broke apart, my forehead resting against his. "Now we see," he said simply. "We take it one day at a time, one moment at a time. We build something new on the foundation of what we had, something that fits who we are now instead of who we used to be. And if it doesn't work, if we discover we're too set in our ways, too different from who we used to be, then we'll have loved each other for whatever time we had," he said, "and that will be enough." I stayed until nearly midnight, reluctant to break the spell of the evening. We talked about practical things, how to tell our children, when to meet each other's families, how to navigate the logistics of two independent people learning to share their lives again. But underneath the practical discussions was something deeper, a sense of coming home after a very long journey. As Thomas walked me to my car, I found myself marveling at the strangeness of it all. 6 weeks ago, I'd been a widow going through the motions of living, content with my books and my garden and my weekly calls with the children. Now I was a woman in love, giddy with possibility and terrified of the future in equal measure. "Sleep well, Thomas," said, kissing my cheek in the driveway. "You too," I replied, though I suspected neither of us would sleep much that night. I drove home through the quiet streets, past houses where other families were settling in for the evening, past the cemetery where Robert lay, past the coffee shop where Thomas and I had been slowly, carefully rebuilding what we'd lost. The town looked different somehow, charged with possibility, as if the very act of falling in love again had transformed the landscape of my life. At home, I found myself standing once again in front of the mirror in my bedroom, studying the woman looking back at me. She was still 67, still marked by time and loss and the accumulated weight of living. But there was something new in her expression, something that spoke of hope and courage and the willingness to risk heartbreak for the possibility of happiness. She looked, I thought, with a mixture of amazement and terror, like a woman who was about to embark on the greatest adventure of her later life. and she was ready for it.